Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks very much for coming. So I would like to pick up this week. I'd like to focus on another segment of the Rambam. We'll branch off a little bit from it as we move along. The last week I was trying to focus on, we kind of call it the philosophical anthropology, meaning how the Rambam understands the soul of a person, or the nefesh of a person, and the impact and implication of kind of that conception. He actually refers to it medically. He talks about like doctors. From our vantage point, we're not talking about the kind of the biology and the science of it as much as a kind of a worldview that emanates from how we see ourselves, and tried to kind of portray two ways of thinking about what it means to have a nefesh. And what seems to be a more contemporary, modern, if not postmodern, or modern way of thinking about it is that there are two sides inside of a person that are kind of warring with each other. In the general world, that would be the rational and the irrational sides that are fighting with each other. In the Jewish world, that would mean the Yetzer Tov and the Yetzer Hara. This does not mean that it's only modern as opposed to ancient. It just means that that's a kind of thinking that comes and goes, and that we see happening over the course of time, which is kind of an idea, but I want to try to flesh out the implications of such an idea, which basically sees the sides of us as kind of one better and one less good, and the need for one side to suppress the other side. That whole way of thinking is something the Rambam does not accept. He doesn't think like that. The Rambam, the idea that he starts with, that the nefesh of a person is nefesh achat, is to try to drive home the idea that a person is a person. The nefesh is not a spiritual side, which is a contrast to a physical side. The nefesh is the psyche, the personality, the intangible, for sure. But it's not about a good and a bad. It's just about that driving distinctive characteristic of a person, and how that drives the decision making and everything that a person does, which then makes the person's job, what God wants from us, is to figure out how to then take that capacity and make ourselves the best people that we possibly can be. Which means that mitzvot then are focused on, what we ended with last time, was that while there are lots of different kinds of senses and different kinds of aspects of the nefesh of a person, what the mitzvot are actually really about are about what he calls the appetites. And the appetites we would refer to as the emotions and the drives. So the desire to eat and drink and enjoy the pleasures of the world in that sense, a sexual drive, those kinds of things are the appetites, and the emotions, the emotional sides of us, joy and sadness and anger and patience and all of those things. And the mitzvot are there to help us along that path. Just that idea is actually a very important kind of shift, because part of that shift of making it not between one side and another, two warring sides, but about the person, what the Rambam also then does is that the mitzvot then, why are we supposed to work on this? It's not other directed, it's actually ourselves directed. The Rambam says that as a Jewish person, my responsibility is to make myself the best person that I can possibly be in terms of all of these things. So now I'd like to move to chapter 4 of Shmona Prakim, where the Rambam actually starts to try to concretize, although still in general categories, some of what he's talking about. And here he is taking, we see very clearly how he is bringing together, he's drawing on Aristotle, but making Aristotle Jewish in terms of how he understands what the goal is. And that's why we're going to be talking about the golden mean, which is an Aristotelian type of idea, finding that middle of the road between the sides. And we'll kind of ask for your help in terms of trying to play it out in terms of the specifics of what it is that he's driving at. Sometimes I feel like that's a nice idea. We always want to be like moderate. but what actually does that mean and how well are we doing? Because the Rambam actually wants us to be really critical of ourselves and what we're doing in terms of these things, not just say what sometimes we tend to say, which is, we all think we're pretty much the middle, because you can always point to people on one side and the other. The Rambam wants us to take a more serious look at that. Yes?
As the patient said to the psychiatrist, I have one question before we begin. What you mentioned last time that the Rambam felt he disagreed with Aristotle because he believed you could learn how to feel differently, and you used the word learn.
Yeah.
So that implies a cognitive approach. A clinician would call it cognitive. In other words, you could learn how to feel differently. You could learn that when you're grieving, learn how not to feel sad. Now that assumes that the feeling or the power of the feeling that you have does not interfere with your cognitive ability to learn. Supposing the person is so clinical, and I'm talking as a clinician who's seen this, so clinically depressed, so sad that they're barely functional, that
Yes.
they're thinking of doing away with themselves, that they cry all day, whatever, and that their thinking is really impaired.
Right.
How would Rambam accept other kinds of interventions to help that person
Okay,
at
that's
least
great.
be able to learn?
Okay, so first, I'm probably going to skirt your question by validating all the things that you said. Meaning, what's important to note is that all of those things that you pointed to is exactly what the Rambam thinks, and I'm kind of glad that you formulated that way, because I would like for us to kind of get into that mode of thinking. We don't always think like that. That the emotions and the cognition, our emotional selves and our cognitive selves are intertwined in Greek thought and in Maimonidean thought, and less so in kind of modern psychological thought, although maybe it's kind of coming back a little bit. And yes, he does believe that you can learn those things, whether that means that now learning, though, we'll see, is not only about what's going on in your head. You can learn kinesthetically, you can learn with your body, doing things is also a mode of learning, and that's what we're going to see. But the part that I'm going to skirt is that the extreme, meaning I don't know, meaning of the Rambam's descriptions of the most extreme circumstances that we will sometimes think of in terms of kind of people who are in really dire psychological circumstances. But I'm going to use that as kind of validation of what I think is remarkable about the Rambam, the degree to which he is kind of in tune. I don't know what he would, I don't know anything more than to say you got to keep trying the same kinds of things. I don't know what he would say, but it does support the fact that his basic frame is what we would call psychologically. I don't want to say that that the Rambam believed that people should go to therapy in this kind of like anachronistic type of way. But I do kind of think
medication.
But his medication is not talking about taking medicine. His medication is about doing this kind of work. And what's so remarkable, I think, is that it makes me wonder the degree to which the Rambam calls the doctor of the soul, that there's a doctor, he keeps on drawing this analogy between the doctor, the health and illness of the body, and the physical doctor, the doctor of the body, to the health and illness of the soul and the doctor of the soul, which we think of as a psychologist or a rabbi, or maybe how do those roles overlap or not. And I think that there's like a lot to explore in the Rambam. I don't want to overstate the comparison, but I actually also want to draw that comparison, because I think that that's what he's pointing to. You don't just ask the rabbi, and I don't think it's gendered either, but you don't just ask the rabbi for your halachic shilas, what should you do and what shouldn't you do. Actually, the role of that healer of the soul is actually to help work out all these things that he's trying to to drive at. And then some cases are just very extreme. So let's get started and read a little bit. I'm going to ask for your help really just trying to unpack some of the examples. There's like a lot of words here. And so he says, good deeds are such as are equal balanced, maintaining the mean between two equally bad extremes, the too much and the too little. So what it means for something to be good is to be in the middle. Virtues are psychic conditions and dispositions which are midway between two reprehensible extremes, one of which is characterized by an exaggeration, the other by a deficiency. And good deeds are the product of these dispositions. So I'll stop here for a second. The Ram is making a clear distinction between the virtues, which is a psychic kind of a mindset, who I am as a person on the inside, and the behaviors, the actions that I perform. And there's a relationship between the actions and the virtues, or lack of virtues. Those three things are related. In this sentence, he says good deeds are the products of good virtues. If I am a virtuous person, the actions I'm going to perform the actions will be in turn virtuous as a result of that. We're going to see later that that works in the other direction too for the Rambam, which is good deeds actually help bring a person to become more virtuous, which will be a little bit of his kind of educational discussion as we go further. And it's also interesting to note that he will every time will point to the middle means that there's an extreme on one side and an extreme on the other side. And I'll leave it at that for now. And let's read it. And then he goes through a bunch of examples. He says to illustrate, moderation is a disposition which adopts a mid-course between inordinate passion and total insensibility to pleasure. Now that's a category. Now part of what I feel, what I'm uncertain about in our setting here, it feels really important, but it's not like a kind of like a fancy sheer thing. It's just like kind of unpacking what it's talking about. Like pleasure is a big category. Like that encompasses an enormous amount of our world, and Rambam's writing one sentence, right? And he basically is saying when it comes to pleasure, there are different dispositions that a person can have. Have as much pleasure as I can possibly, as much of an opportunity for pleasure as I can possibly figure out how to have, or I can say, pleasure is dangerous, so I'm going to minimize that as much as possible. Those are two extremes. Sometimes, and I think this is part of the Rambam's chiddush in terms of what he's trying to argue, we put that into, we stereotype those. The hedonists, are not the noble people. They're just kind of looking to get from this world as much as possible. Religious people realize that it's really about bigger things or another world or something like that, and therefore we're going to restrict that kind of experience. In my view, I'm kind of projecting this out a little, but I think it's true, that if you end up thinking that the nefesh is split, it kind of pushes you to try to push down the physical side and try to raise up the spiritual side, meaning there's like lots of, I feel like complicated daily-ish decisions that you make, kind of every day. Sometimes I think about it, like, what path have I kind of taken from the time that I was, a teenager over the past 20 or 30 years? Like now where have I settled, in terms of this? What kind of pleasures is that like value? Is that just like what I got used to? Like how? And in terms of, so here's the part. Can you, do you feel kind of able to complicate that kind of experience or the question of pleasure for yourself in that kind of way? Like when it comes to eating, for example. So the Rambam took eating very seriously. If I asked you if eating is a religion, like how you eat, is that like a religion? Is that like, what is that? Where does that fall in the? Well, obviously I could be like a good person. I can be a good Jew. I don't know. They like good Jews who eat well. The good Jews who don't eat well. It has nothing to do with my being a good Jew or not. Actually, Rambam thinks that how you eat is actually relevant to your being a good Jew. Now I have to say now, because I'm not sure how much we're going to be able to get to it, before we're over. It's like the Rambam actually thinks all of that is not just because you should be healthy and that's it, but you can't serve God the way that you should unless you're healthy, and that's why that's kind of a next step. And I want that next step to be in that background all the time, because it always has to be there. That's the ultimate goal. It's not just about me, it's about me in the interest of something bigger. But since we're talking about midot, we're going to be just talking about the me part, and we're not going to be spending that much time on in the interest of. And I hope that you can kind of hold on to that all the time anyway. But that's like a thing. Now, can we imagine, the Rambam would say that when I'm going to go home tonight, and I have, my reality is I eat pretty well in the morning and the afternoon, and I'm in pretty good till dinner. And then, like after 9 o'clock, it all falls apart. I start doing, that.
You get hungry.
You get that. Now, I don't mean to make this lightly, and I certainly don't mean, right, this is not, but the Rambam will say that makes a difference in terms of who you are as a person. You have to think about, like, what are you doing? Like, you got to stop. God gave things in the world. You're supposed to think about that. Now, I also don't want to make this into like you should be healthy, like, diet. It's an inner virtue type of thing in terms of how you think about food, how you think about drink, how you think about, but the goal of us trying to, once you start thinking about that, well, where else does that actually happen? Where else does that play out? Like alcohol, in terms of those kinds of pleasures, or alcohol, things like that.
Self-control?
Also, for Rambam, self-control is enormously important, but he also says self-control, you can't just talk about it that way, because then you're going to focus on the self-control in a particular direction, and that's also a fault. There has to be this kind of balance, which, by the way, if you should already kind of get the sense once you start thinking about this, that the one thing that's for sure is that if it's true that either side is problematic, and that means that there's a constant monitoring, which is not what we do, right? Which, what we tend to do is we're in a rhythm, and whatever that rhythm is, we think it's pretty moderate, and so we live like that. For the Rambam, the Rambam actually thinks this is hard work, and the hard work is to be constantly attuned to what we're doing. Not to be obsessive about it. That's also an extreme, which is a problem, which Rambam talks about. But it's about being attuned in a certain kind of way to all the things that we're doing. So that's just a pleasure example, and then he's got a whole bunch of other categories, which we'll see. Shelley, do you have?
No, it was funny because you were talking about the food thing, and it was a conversation that had come to mind that we had last week. It was people around the table, a group of people around the table, and some of them were just espousing how they were foodies, and they talked about various websites and where you can get the best natural kosher meat. I went on this website, looked at it, and I saw for less than a pound, there was a piece of meat there that was $189, and I was floored. I was just absolutely floored, and I thought, there was almost an essence of Chilul Hashem. I felt that any person who goes on this website and sees this kosher food, that they should think that Jews are thinking to spend this kind of money for kosher meat. I just made me cringe, and I thought, like, to me, that's the example that came to mind more than the 9 p.m., which I have the same problem you do. After 9 p.m., that's like when you're kind of, but really more of just like, how we approach. I mean, we're thinking about kashrus, we're thinking about being healthy, having no hormone, antibiotic food, this and that, and then it gets taken to an extreme. Well, that you're actually pointing to is also a different category that the Rambam's going to point to, which is about money, wealth, and extravagance, and what you use it for. I mean, if you really think about, that's a kind of a combination of two different arenas, and the goal here is not just to be clear. Like, I don't, I feel like the spirit of this conversation is that we're all implicated in this, right? And that our goal is to say, like, there are ways in which I think that we all need to pay attention to the different things that he's talking about. But I also want you to appreciate, if I can convey kind of the tension
because what the Rambam is going to say, we're going to see later, is that the observance of mitzvot is very connected to developing these virtues. And it's a danger to then say it's about the virtues and not about the mitzvot, in the same way that it's a danger to say that it's about the mitzvot and not about the virtues. For the Rambam, these things work together, so the performance of mitzvot are supposed to be in the interest of developing these kinds of dispositions, but that requires us to take all those things very seriously.
Shelley raised, by raising the issue of the money involved, it just shows how each of these issues becomes very intertwined. So the monitoring is like monitoring on several levels at the same time and figuring out multiple strands.
Yes.
A little more complicated still.
For sure, right. It's yes. I don't know. Sometimes when I'm talking, speaking to it, I feel like, oh my God, it's like so overwhelming because there's so many places. Like, how do you manage that?
Yeah.
Most of the time, I actually feel like that feels right. It feels exciting and right, actually, to think about. Like, why do I? What is the right amount of? What is kind of moderation and good measure in terms of all these things, and to actually think about it and consider what's. It can be an energizing kind of challenge to determine kind of for yourself, to get yourself out, and certainly the self-control part of it is a big piece of it. Let's go on so we can get a little bit more of a feel here.
But it seems like there's a conflict even in, halacha is so specific and so detailed and so exacting.
So I'm going to ask, what I'd like to do, because this is number one. Number four is where the Rambam talks about the halacha part of it. So I want to we'll talk about, we'll get to that too, hopefully. Moderation then is a proper rule of conduct, and the psychic disposition which gives rise to it is an ethical quality. He means to split those into two things. There's a way of behaving, and then there's an ethical quality that derives from that. But inordinate passion, the extreme of excess, inordinate passion, that's the example of extreme of excess. Total insensibility to enjoyment, that's the extreme of deficiency. Those are both absolutely pernicious. Now this is a translation, but that's a serious word. The Rambam, we're going to see at the end, he is not, he is anti any ascetic leanings in religion, in Judaism, and religions, Judaism too, definitely has ascetic streams where you feel like the most religious people are the people who separate off. Now, it's pretty clear that the Rambam, now, just before we pat ourselves on the back, because the Rambam says we should be ascetic, we should enjoy. Rambam seems to have been very, I'm not sure that he had this in mind, but he does have in mind that we are not supposed to be, so we're supposed to enjoy the things that we enjoy. That's part. Just as an example of halacha, when we say that Jews eat all the time, every time there's always a sudas this and a sudas that, for the Rambam, that's correct. It's supposed to be. Now, how you do it, how much you do it, what does that look like? You have to think about that, but there's no question that you're not supposed to fast on a yontif. That's wrong, because the pleasure is actually part of developing that kind of disposition. That's part of what the Rambam is shooting for. Let's go on. The psychic dispositions in which these two extremes, inordinate passion and insensibility, result, the one being an exaggeration of the deficiency, are classed among moral imperfections. Okay, it's the same thing. Those two sides are the problem. Now, I'd like to kind of just look at the bolds, because those are some of his examples, and have us, kind of imagine what the different sides are. So just kind of to get into the vibe he was talking about. So generosity. So it's kind of a spirit of generosity. That's a mean between sordidness. It's like being miserly, and extravagance. How about courage? Courage is a virtue. When does courage stop being a virtue?
It's reckless, when it's silly.
When
you endanger yourself.
You can do something that's just dumb. And the Rambam's going to say in the next paragraph, though, our tendency is to look at somebody who does something like that and say, that guy's really cool. And the Rambam's saying, no, that's not good. You're not supposed to do that. Now, where do you draw that line? That's a good question. If somebody Years ago when I was a kid, there was still a discussion about whether skiing was okay or fell in that category or not. Everybody skis now. It's okay, jump out of a plane. It's like, where do you draw the line? That's fine. The goal here is not to make those decisions. It's also, do you stand up again to a fight with somebody because you're going to be the tough guy, or do you say, like, how do you manage? You're not supposed to be meek, but you're supposed to be kind of strong enough. Further, dignity between haughtiness and loudishness, managing dignity the same. Humility between arrogance and self-abasement. Contentedness between avarice and slothful indifference. And magnificence between meanness and profusion. So this has to do with, kind of all these examples have to do with how you deal, a lot of them have to do with how you deal with stuff that you have, and also how you deal with kind of your emotional, how much honor, how to deal with your desire for honor and humility and stuff like that. In the Mishnah Torah, he actually points to a couple of others, which are kind of interesting. Patience. What are the sides of patience? I just kind of gave you that and said, like, what are the two extremes that are unhealthy when it comes to patience?
Being stoic might be the extreme of not reacting at all.
Meaning there's a negative even to not react, to having nothing ever gets you. You never lose your pen. Nothing ever gets to you. Ram thinks that's a weakness. Nothing ever gets to you. There's nothing where you say, like, this is wrong. If you're like that, you can't stand up to what you think is right because nothing ever gets to you. What's the other side? It's what? Sorry? Rashness. Yeah. I mean, for the Rambam, he goes to town on anger. Anger is a very, very big thing for him. I might talk about that next time. And so that's kind of the other side. Modesty is the second one. Being immodest is a problem. What's the other side? I'm not sure he thinks it's an inner virtue. So I'm not sure he's thinking about the behavior, although that might, there's a meekness, right? That you don't see that you have any kind of presence. That's like a problem. He even has humor as an example. Humor is a virtue. What's the weakness? What's the weak version of that? Weak versions of humor. If you can't laugh at anything, then even I'm a serious person. If you can't kind of be lighthearted at any point, that's a problem. You can also be way too lighthearted. Everything is like a joke. You're not serious. Just kind of a clown. And I think like of examples like that, and it's so easy to me to imagine. Like we just assume, well, there's some people who are like that, and there's some people who are like that. Actually, we're going to see the Rambam also thinks there's some people who are like that, and there's some people who are like that. He just says that's not the end of the story. Because the people need to, and he's not trying to create robots, he knows that people are going to be different from each other. But actually, it's not just, and here's the learning part, it's not just that some people are like this and some people are like that. You have to work on it and try to figure out how to strike the right balance. And then doing that is, just to say it again, a Jewish activity, and one that is the purpose of mitzvot, according to the Rambam. It's actually to figure out how to do that. And the actions and the virtues are actually intertwined in terms of figuring out how to strike the right balance. I'm not going to read the next paragraph, which is basically just pointing to the fact that sometimes, we look at it and praise the wrong things, and what we need to do is be thoughtful for ourselves, but also when we're observing things. Like just because it seems like a cool thing, that's it can still be problematic. It can still be a mistake. Okay. Number 2. So, how do you learn? How does this actually happen? So the Rambam has number 2 says this is just he says, know moreover that these moral excellences or defects cannot be acquired or implanted in the soul except by means of the frequent repetition of acts resulting from these qualities, which practice during a long period of time accustoms us to them. The Rambam uses that there are a couple of That's interesting. Could be mitoch shalol lishma ba lishma, something like that until you internalize it. The Sefer HaChinuch actually has a famous phrase, which he postdates the Rambam, but acharei pe'ulot neshachim al levavot, that you do the actions and then that directs you in a particular way. The Rambam uses the word hergel all the time. And hergel means practice. It means to practice until it actually has, it kind of leaves an impression. And people who wrote in Rabbi Yisrael Salanter's time, there's lots of kind of description in ways in which, it's actually an interesting side note, that there were those, when Rabbi Yisrael Salanter writes about this kind of idea, because he also believes in the idea of practice, if you're about one of the Balei Musar, they say that the way in which you cultivate these capacities is you have to keep on practicing. So they would describe it in the 19th century as when you perform an action, it leaves a trace, a roshem, on the inner recesses of your mind, and then you do it again and it leaves a trace, and you do it again and it leaves a trace, and if you keep on doing it, it actually reshapes the way that your brain works, which actually caused Rabbi Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg and some other kind of early scholars to say that Rabbi Yisrael Salanter knew of the unconscious before Freud, which people say it was like, okay, no, but that was the climate of figuring there was a.
We know that the more exposures you have to something, the easier it is to remember it.
Yeah, now we take that. That was kind of a mode of thinking, which then, so it doesn't take that shape in the Rambam. He doesn't talk about it in terms of that thing, but by the 19th century, they are talking about it in that way.
To
and
coin the phrase, practice makes perfect.
Yes,
practice helps us internalize what we should be doing.
Yes, and so and then it becomes kind of a part of kind of a part of us. And so he says, if these acts performed are good ones, then we shall have gained a virtue. But if they are bad, we shall have acquired a vice. Stop here for 1 second. This, by the way, is already a hint at what the Rambam understands the role of mitzvot to be. What is a mitzvah, then? A mitzvah is an action that you're supposed to perform regularly, and the idea of performing it regularly, then that's supposed to shape the kind of person you are and make you into a virtuous person, that you develop certain kinds of character traits because of the mitzvah that you have. I want to emphasize again that there's kind of a step here in the Rambam. We tend to think of mitzvot as doing what God wants. The Rambam actually also thinks that it's doing what God wants, but there's like a little step there. What God wants is for us to become the best people we can be, so that we can then understand what it is that God wants. That might sound like a kind of a minor stutter step, but it's like a enormous difference, because basically what it means is that we're supposed to focus on making ourselves the best that we possibly can be. And I just want to do the next thing, because here's where he clearly acknowledges that people don't. He says, since, however, no man is born with an innate virtue or vice, right? So Ram believes that everybody's able to get to that middle. No one is born. I have to say two things. Ram changed this in Mishnah Torah. Here he says no one is born without any virtue or vice, but he says, let me start the sentence again. I'm going to read what it says here, and I'll tell you what it says in Mishnah Torah. No one is born with virtue or vice, and as everyone's conduct from childhood up is undoubtedly influenced by the manner of living of his relatives and countrymen, his conduct may be in accord with the rules of moderation. But then again, it is possible that his acts may incline towards either extreme, as we have demonstrated, in which case his soul becomes diseased. That means, according to the Rambam, a person is born clean, but we are raised in social contexts. And those social contexts might or might not be healthy. And so we might be, our nefesh might be diseased, in which case we need to do work to straighten ourselves out. Now, in the Mishnah Torah, the Rambam says people are born with dispositions lakan ulakan, and which is an important shift. He actually that came later. That's an important shift. And on top of that, people are raised in a certain context, and those all come together in a certain kind of way. That just means that's your lot and your challenge. but it's not an excuse, because if you work on it, you can actually shape it. And here again, he makes reference to the illness thing. In such a contingency, it is proper for him to resort to a cure, exactly as he would were his body suffering from an illness. So just as when the equilibrium of the physical health is disturbed, and we know which way it is tending in order to force it to go in exactly the opposite direction until it shall return to its proper condition. This is also famous in the Rambam, that if you're tilting this way, the way that you get back to the middle is by turning too far in the other direction so that you can kind of land back in the middle. And just as when the proper adjustment is reached, we seize this operation and have recourse to that which will maintain the proper balance, in exactly the same way must we adjust the moral equilibrium. So morality and ethics is actually central to, and inner virtue is actually central to the purpose of all the mitzvot. Our job is to perform the mitzvot, but for performing mitzvot, we need to also pay attention to how those are helping us figure out the moderate way in terms of all of these challenges. It seems to me that that would open up a whole kind of different set of things that we should, that we would, if we were taking it seriously, a whole different set of things that we would be paying attention to in terms of extravagance and, again, how we deal with the things that we have and how we deal with our inner kind of emotions. It's not like I just have a bad temper. You can't just have a bad temper. That might be a challenge. You need to work on it. Well, I'm shy, so I don't like to kind of step up, and so it's hard work. Nobody's saying, and not everybody's going to arrive at, and God's gonna. But our work is to figure out how to be able to move ourselves in a particular direction, and when it comes to wealth and possessions and how that's managed and all of that, also very important. I also, as a kind of a side piece, that I think that kind of contemporary what's his name, Fairbairn, the psychologist in the 1940s, writes a lot about the way in which, unrelated to the Rambam, that some of these two weaknesses are actually usually present at the same time. Like if you don't have moderation, you're usually doing both of the extremes, depending on the circumstance, and that both either extreme is actually a sign of lack of moderation. Because we tend to think it's like either you struck the right balance, or you're like this or like that. His insight, which I think is a very powerful insight, is that when we are lacking moderation, we tend to do both extremes, depending. I want to go to. Does this kind of resonate? Can you imagine how that is? Sometimes people who are worried about, we're talking about anger. If you're worried about your temper, so sometimes you're going to kind of hold it in as much as you can, and then you're going to explode when you can't, or you'll be, extremely generous, but then sometimes you'll pull back. Something that is just erratic when it's not moderate, and I think that's actually very kind of interesting insight. And I just have to also say that I love one of the parts of what I love about learning these Rambams are the ways in which kind of psychology and these Rambams actually totally connect in what I think is a really remarkable kind of way. Now, this is just to take a step. Take a step to the side for a second. I want to move to something else for a second. I just found this next thing to be just kind of the coolest thing. If you can turn to the last pages, I guess. This one with the title on it. When I started paying attention to, when I was focusing on the theme of the year, so I found myself splitting my time to learning like Rambam's and Rabbi Tully Harcsztark's texts. And when people write the kind of biography of Rabbi Tully Harcsztark and how he was a big Talmud Chacham at a young age, and in his 20s determined that, there's a lot of learning going on. The way that he writes it in Zigeres HaMusar, everybody washes its yadayim, but people aren't so careful about the way in which they're managing their business dealings, and he wanted to work on that, and actually wanted to work with the broader community, not just with the people sitting in the yeshiva. And in the 1840s, he published a sefer, and they credit, when they talk about Rav Yisrael Salanter's influences, they talk about this sefer called Sefer Cheshbon HaNefesh. This was published, this was written by, as it says, Rav Mendel Ish Satanov, Mendel Satanover, they call him. And he was, as it turns out, a maskil. He was there was a very wealthy Polish nobleman at the end of the 18th century, Adam Cherniakov, I think his name was, and he was Mendel Satanover's patron. Basically provided for him to do his thing. And Mendel Satanov, even though Mendel Satanov sounds like a Hasidic Rebbe, he was actually a maskil who was actually interested in being able to bridge kind of the Polish community and the Jewish community in a certain kind of way. And he wrote this book called Cheshbon HaNefesh. And I just want you to turn the page to the next side by letter Chaf in the middle of the page. It's Od Chaf in the Sefer. And he started in the pages before this, he's writing about how he's not writing a Maimonidean book, but he's actually writing off of that, saying that people need to work on their character traits. We're not, doing the work that we need to do, and why is it so hard? Maybe generations before, people were able to turn and just say, cold turkey, I do this wrong. He said, maybe our great rabbis used to be able to do that. We can't do that anymore. We need to do something else. So he starts to write about what it is that he, the way in which he thinks this should happen. And then look at Od Chaf. He says, a few years ago, there's revealed this great strategy. This is, he thinks, a wondrous creation when it comes to developing the virtues, Tikun HaMidot. That he says, I think, is going to spread. It's a great line. Thinks it's going to spread. This is going to spread around the world like the printing press. Right? He's writing this is the greatest discovery since the printing press. Going to go all over the place. It actually combines all the elements that you need in order to be able to actually work on yourself. Dahainu sha'ot shchiva v'kima, things that you have to do when you wake up and go to sleep. Chinuchim, kind of exercises, like chinuch means training, exercises. V'cheshbon HaNefesh, and then doing a calculation at the end of the day, a self-assessment. El shi mechaseret et tircham, but it takes away the pain of it. Umarvachat kiflei kiflai metualtam, and makes the benefit enormous. Einedim mevalet hazman kemohem. Adarabba, whatever, you can go the rest of the thing. Okay, I'll stop with the reading of this. What's the great strategy? So if you turn the page, he says this is his strategy towards the end of the book. He describes it. He says you should take a notebook, and he's very specific. You should take a notebook that has
These are the
60 pages, and he says there are 13 behaviors, and the Aleph to Zayin is Sunday through Shabbos. And he says that the idea here is, if you take the Hergel concept of the Rambam, so he says there are 52 weeks in the year, and people, you focus on, you make a resolution, and then you do it for a week, and then you forget about it. So he says this idea actually is trying to capitalize on that. So do it for a week, don't forget about it, but do it for a week, and then next week actually do the next thing. Take the next one seriously. And then the third week, take another, you're going to forget, do the next one seriously. Then after 13 weeks, you start again. So basically what that allows is that over the course of the year, if you have 13, meaning what's interesting is that we think of, Rabbi Tully Harcsztark is famous for having 13 midot, which we tend to, 13 is a big number, God has 13 midot, there are 13 midot Shatar Nedreshet, there are 13 midot Rabbi Tully Harcsztark. Actually the 13 midot are 13 midot because 13 times 4 is 52, and it actually works well in the calendar year, so that over the course of a year, you're able to
There aren't 52 weeks in a Jewish calendar then? In the Hebrew calendar.
oh, that's actually a very interesting question that you ask. It's a great segue to the next thing.
It's a little OCD and a little bit conflicts with moderation.
It can. So that's a good question. I'm not trying to kind of sell the strategy. I do actually find it very, interesting for two reasons. First, I find it interesting for somebody actually putting in the time to say, like, think about the piece. Meaning, there's a. I would be concerned about that too. What's interesting to me is how much kind of awareness of human, the pre part of it. It's like, okay, we do want to work on these things, but it's like a big kind of blob of things. You don't really know like how to work on it, and then we start and then we stop, and it doesn't really last, and we can't really just make a decision. So this is kind of a process in order to be able to kind of work it through. But why is it the 52 weeks of the year so interesting? So this is what's really, I think, pretty cool about this is if you turn back, you'll find on page 4 a similar kind of chart where it also has 13 in English, 13 midot. Temperance is the first one, silence is the second one. I don't remember all of them. We'll see in the page before that in a second. And then Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. And then if on Sunday you made a mistake with one of those categories, you put a little dot into that one. And if on Monday you put a dot there, Tuesday was okay, so you leave that blank, etc. So where did that come from? So if you go back to page 3, this comes from Benjamin Franklin, which I actually thought was pretty remarkable. When Benjamin Franklin was in France, wrote an autobiography and his, my personal life, whatever that he wrote in French, which is translated into English. And in that, he writes that he was bothered by this question. It's like, how do I actually develop the virtues? Like, what's my strategy for developing the virtues? And then if you just look at I'm not going to read the whole thing. You can read it if you want, but you can just like to see the italicized words. So you can see like some of the words that correspond to the chart on the second page. You'll see that there's silence is a virtue, order is a virtue, resolution, like to be resolute, make a decision and stick to it is a virtue, frugality is a virtue, and on and on. What is I think it's fascinating to imagine that Rabbi Yisrael, there's a somebody did this work actually to line up Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, if he actually had them. Rabbi Yisrael Salanter's 13 midot, with Mendel Satanever's 13 midot and Benjamin Franklin's 13 midot. There's like lots of overlap, but they're not exactly the same. If you line them up with the Rambam's categories, they weren't using the Rambam, and there's like some similarities you can imagine, although the list is not exactly the same. There is a way in which they're not writing a Maimonidean something, but the disposition, where it's coming from, is a very similar kind of thing. It's not about like working on your soul, stamping out averos and doing stuff like that. It's actually developing the capacity to be able to act in a certain kind of way, but figuring out a strategy to train yourself. You might not like, meaning I didn't give this to my kids to say like, here, we're going to start like doing this way. But it is actually interesting in terms of what's missing, because it actually does point to we don't really have a strategy to work on that. We don't have a way to say like, well, can I identify the things that I know that I should be better at? Can I develop practices so that I can get better at it? And am I willing to look at it afterwards and say, well, how did I do? And then do it again. We know that we do that kind of thing in other areas, like school. I mean, that's what the whole thing is about. Sometimes we'll do an exercise. We'll do it in our work.
Behavior modification.
It is a very behavior modification-ish kind of idea, and that's with an awareness, right? With kind of an awareness of the ways in which that impacts on your kind of your emotional and appetitive well-being. Let's go to the top of page 3. It'll be the last chunk that we'll do from And this is how kind of we see that this is the Rambam's understanding of mitzvot. And it would be interesting to me, after we just read a little bit, to hear, I want to know whether it's clear the way in which this becomes like a significantly different way of thinking about mitzvot, and how that kind of strikes you if it does. So the Rambam says, like, if the Rambam thinks that you have to develop virtues, and the virtues have to be of moderation, and the moderation, kind of that middle of the road, is rooted in Aristotle. Where does the halacha fit in? So for the Rambam, that's what halacha is. It's about actually training ourselves in moderation in all of these kinds of categories. That is the goal. Now, there have been essays written about the difference. The Rambam and Aristotle are not the same. For Aristotle, you can fiddle this way or that. Halacha is not fiddling. You got to keep to the halacha. You also have to be aware of what its kind of ultimate goals are. So the Rambam writes, the law did not lay down its prohibitions or enjoin its commandments except for just this purpose, namely that by its disciplinary effects we may persistently maintain the proper distance from either extreme. That's as clear as can be. The purpose of the mitzvot is to train ourselves in this kind of way. Now, what do you think of this? He says, for the restrictions regarding all the forbidden foods, the prohibitions of illicit intercourse, the forewarning against prostitution, the duty of performing the legal marriage rites, all of these God commanded in order that we should keep entirely distant from the extreme of the inordinate indulgence of the passions, so that they may be firmly rooted in our soul's disposition for moderation. That means kashrus and all sexual stuff. That's about developing moderation when it comes to the passions. Probably not shocking regarding the sexual stuff. I'm wondering how people react to the idea of that being what kashrus is about. When the Rambam codified his Mishnah Torah, which has 14 books in it, the Yad HaChazakah, one of them was called Kedusha, and what's encompassed in Kedusha is the laws of Shchita, Hilchos, and all that comes, Machos, Asuros, Shchita, Machos, Asuros, and Isurei Bia. That means shechting animals, food you're not allowed to eat, and illicit sexual relations. That's Kedusha. Because those kinds of things, that goes into Kedusha, meaning that's what Kedusha actually literally means. We call it holy, it means separate, and separate means kind of being able to take a step back from what goes on in general,
It's
to be
the
able to take a
opposite of
stand of
moderation.
something.
It's the opposite of moderation.
No, he actually thinks it's moderation. People.
It's precise and but.
Moderation that's worth talking about. Moderation for the Rambam doesn't mean it's kind of not precise, or it means that it is very precise in the interest of cultivating a certain kind of disposition. Now, I'm not saying it's a different question and not for today, and one that's worth exploring. Like, what would the Rambam say about, if people don't get married until their mid or late 20s, how are they supposed to manage that? The marriage rights are all very nice, but when you're, if you get married at 18, that's easier than when you get married at 28. Okay, that's a good question.
About appetite, and that if you're eating, you should eat in moderation. If you're kosher, you don't eat anything in moderation. You don't eat it at all. So it's not moderation.
So the Rambam.
Kashrus is precise and it's prohibited.
Well, he's trying to. He for sure is trying to shift our thinking about that, exactly in the way that maybe reverts back to what we were talking about last week, rather than talking about it in a binary or dualistic kind of way. There's kosher food and there's non-kosher food, which then lends some people to say, this is the healthy stuff and this is the unhealthy stuff, or this is the food that's good for your soul, this is food that's bad for your soul. I'm saying that's actually not what it's about. What it's about is, and you cannot like it, I'm not, it's your choice to tip, but what the Rambam believes for sure is as follows. The purpose of kashrus for him is not about this particular animal is this and that animal is that. The purpose of kashrus is to say, you can't eat everything. I actually, sorry,
But
hold on,
that's
just
not
one second.
moderation.
That, not eating, no, that actually is moderation. You basically can't eat. You, from the day that you're born to the world, you know that you actually need to make decisions from the very beginning. You got to make decisions about what you can and can't indulge in. Now, if you're not then taking the next step is saying, oh, I understand what this is trying to teach me in terms of my general, then you're missing the point, he says. Because it's not really only about just eating this and not eating that. It's actually about developing a certain disposition. When I were learning Hilchos Kashrus in my class in 10th grade, when as soon as like I shared this, different reasons for Kashrus, those health, not health kinds of things, and the Rambam, kids in a second said, oh, that's why when Adam Harishon was created, like the first thing that he got, was told was not to eat that. Yeah, I think actually that's the idea. Not to eat that is you brought into, like our primordial story is, if you think about like Rambam, our primordial story is human beings were created to recognize that they have to set limits and get to be part of the world, but with kind of constraints and controls and stuff like that. And then the Torah systematizes that in a much bigger way. I think that it's much easier to understand what the Rambam's driving at. I understand the food one is like very different than how we tend to understand it. But I think that not splitting it into this side and that side, but taking the whole thing and saying there's a certain approach that is trying to convey through this is, I think, important. It's going to be a party. Yeah. You look like you had something to say. Oh, I thought you did. Okay. Yes.
But you're supposed to eat a certain amount of meat and fish for Oneg Shabbat. That's...
Well, certainly no amount that you have to eat.
No. If you believe in moderation. So you don't eat so much meat until you get sick, and you don't eat so much fish until you get sick. That would be moderation. But if you don't say you should eat that much shellfish until you don't get sick. There's a difference between exclusion and inclusion up to a certain point.
Yeah,
So I don't see kashrut as moderation.
But it narrows the field within which you have to work on the virtue. It narrows the field for you. Maybe as human beings we don't have the capacity to work on it that broadly.
So Judaism is an applied religion, and there are certain laws that apply. It's doing, and doing is mitzvot. Doing is keeping Shabbos. Doing is keeping.
So
kashrut.
I got it. I have 5 minutes.
All
I just want to
right,
finish. I'll say I understand what you're saying, and I think that the Rambam's trying to shift that around.
He skirts it.
Well, he's got a whole system, so I don't know it's skirting. I think he's tackling, but definitely a different way of thinking about it. At any rate, so there's a reason why there are different ways of thinking in Judaism. People are attracted to different ways of thinking about it. He takes this further, just to get to some of the other examples. He says, likewise, all that is contained in the law concerning the giving of tithes, the gleaning of the harvest, that means giving maser, meaning supporting the Kohen, leket, shikha, and peah, the forgotten sheaves, the single grapes, the small bunches of in the vineyards for the poor, the law of the sabbatical year and of the jubilee, the giving of charity according to the wants of the needy one. All these approach the extreme of lavishness to be practiced in order that we may depart far from its opposite, stinginess, and thus nearing the extreme of excessive prodigality, there may be instilled in us the quality of generosity. Okay, it's a long sentence. Its point being, obviously tzedakah is for the poor. Rambam does not tend to define the mitzvot in that way, even though that's obviously true. The purpose, when you're doing a mitzvah, you have to also be aware of which that's supposed to. In this instance, all of these mitzvot are there in order to teach us to let go, to just be able to let go. Like this is not just, all right, what do you mean? It's like mine. You have to be able to kind of let go of it. Now, if you let go of too much, that's bad. So they basically kind of set it up in this kind of way, which I think also speaks to the I'll say it's like relatively voluntary, meaning it's not, mitzvot are such that I'm commanded and I do it. It's not like kind of extracted from me because I have to develop that virtue in order to be able to do it. And the same, he says, if you should test most of the commandments from this point of view, you would find that they are all for the discipline and guidance of the faculties of the soul. Thus, the law forbids revenge, the bearing of a grudge, and blood revenge. Similarly, before the hoary head shalt thou rise up and honor the face of the old man. That means standing up for the aged, honor thy father and thy mother, thou shalt not depart from the sentence which they may tell thee, are intended to do away with boldness and produce modesty. Meaning, there are certain mitzvot that are there to teach us respect for authority. There's certain mitzvot that are there to teach us to let go of our kinyanim. There's certain mitzvot that are there to teach us to develop moderation in terms of our passions and our appetites. Between all of those mitzvot, we develop a certain kind of disposition, but then we're also supposed to internalize those values so we can look at other ways and places in which they apply. To me, it seems like if we were taking this seriously, we'd have like a whole different set of things that we'd also be kind of looking at in terms of the way, even like communally, like, okay, we can be moderate in terms of where we fit into the community, but still not be where that just means we're moderate in terms of where we are in the community. It doesn't mean, the whole community is like off in terms of how it's dealing with some of its possessions and money and stuff like that. And I won't read, I'll just say the number 3 that we did not read is for the Rambam, the point of the mitzvah, the idea of the Nazir in the Rambam is a very big idea. For it changes the idea of a Nazir. A person says, I want to set myself up for the service of God, so I'm not going to cut my hair or drink wine or become tamei to a mate. And then afterwards, this is the big puzzle in the Gemara. When the Nazir is finished, he has to bring a korban chatas. He sinned. So why is that? What's that about? And that's a whole debate. Okay, so that's the debate in the Gemara. How you deal with that debate? I guess what the Rambam is actually not saying anything new, but what he's doing is taking that and raising it up to a real principle. The Rambam says that the idea of the Nazir is to teach us that Judaism is not an ascetic religion. That if you need to do that, he says there is such a thing as lifnim mishur asadin. There's such a thing as going beyond the letter of the law. But for the Rambam, the idea of going beyond the letter of the law is in the interest of, if you don't trust that you can keep to the letter of the law, and you need to go beyond the letter of the law to ensure that you're keeping to the letter of the law, that's why you do it. The goal is the letter of the law for the Rambam. That's not what we usually think. We usually think the law is kind of the floor, and with Nimishur Adin, beyond the letter of the law is kind of a ceiling where you keep on going higher. It seems that in the Rambam that's not the case. It's just that human nature is such that it's hard for us. So we need to set boundaries and prevent and do, but in order to make sure that we're not violating it. And so he says that Hasidim would do that, but then Hasidim would pull back further. But then he says foolish people who saw what Hasidim did would say that's what we're supposed to do, when actually maybe didn't make sense for them to do it. So when I read this, for us, I feel like there's a double edge. There's a way in which I feel like so the Rambam is, I like that. It's like the Rambam is not ascetic, should be part of the world, develop virtues, very here and now, and the mitzvot are here to make us certain kinds of certain kind of person, and it's not just about the next world and doing God's command and stuff like that. But the danger is to not, when someone is learning this, then you kind of, you stop the sentence there. That's only half the sentence. The other part of the sentence of the Rambam is, and therefore you actually have to do a lot of work around these things in order to be able to look at it, figure out how to practice it, and do a self-assessment in order to figure out how to be able to kind of perfect these things. And the last sentence I'll say is, and therefore, in thinking about this, I guess, to me the part that would be most meaningful is to think about it in terms of these kinds of emotional and appetitive kinds of categories, like the kind of humility and the arrogance, the patience and impatience, the anger, the sadness and the happiness, and obviously the possessions, the money, and the sexual drives, and all of that, and to think of mitzvot as tools to be able to help us actually cultivate that, ultimately, in order to be able to be, Ovdei Hashem in a stronger kind of way. Stop here. Thank you very much.
I tried it online last week, besides the fact